My name is Jim Overton. I'm a professor in the sociology department at Memorial University. I've been in Newfoundland off and on. I've left a few times, but I've been here since 1973. I think it's fair to say that since the 19th century, since the mid-19th century really, Newfoundland people have left Newfoundland to go and work elsewhere. And very often this has been associated with cycles, economic cycles. You know, for example, when the fishery went through a bad period, people would leave to go and try and find work elsewhere. One of the factors that sometimes drove that was also difficulty with getting any kind of state support to stay at home. For example, in the 19th century, public relief was, minimal, to say the least. And there were certainly periods when the government decided it wasn't going to give public relief to people who were going through periods of hardship, so they kind of encouraged emigration. So I think we have a period of cyclical periods of significant emigration, followed by periods when it was lower, and a few periods when perhaps there was even return migration to Newfoundland, or when people came back, or new people came to settle here. But they're relatively small and few and far between. One exception would be the 1930s. You would think the 1930s would have been a period of kind of dramatic emigration because of the crisis in the fishing industry, but in fact I think in the 1930s it's estimated 10,000 people returned to Newfoundland from Canada and the United States where they'd been working. But of course what happened was that jobs disappeared there in the United States and Canada. People who were not Canadian or US citizens were unable to get public relief, so, and in some cases they were actually deported. So they either decided to come back on their own, made their own choice to come back, or the Canadian officials or the US officials sent them back so that they wouldn't be a burden on the government or the state or whatever it was. So there have been as I say, cycles of emigration. It's been more intense in some periods than in others. But I think for a long period of time that the two places that people went to were the United States and Canada. It continues today. The places that people go to are probably a little more varied than they were then. You now have people going to the Middle East and coming back, after having worked there for a while. But the pattern remains the same. I think it's fair to say that the underlying factor is always economic circumstances that drive people to leave where they're living. So they think they can better themselves elsewhere, get more regular employment, better incomes. But it's always a difficult choice to do that. But one of the things I've been saying is that migration, whether internal, within a particular territory, country, province, but also internationally, has been a part of many people's lives, perhaps the majority of people's lives in the 19th and 20th century. And obviously that has affected the way that people think about a whole range of things. It's affected their culture, their values, their attitudes. I think for many people it's recognized as something that has to be done. If you're going to make something of yourself, get a job, stay employed, you have to be prepared to move to wherever the work is available. So that, on the one hand there's that. On the other hand, most people also experience the difficulties involved in migration. It's not an easy thing to do. You have to be, in a sense, become very unsettled. You've lived in a situation where things are fairly, you understand what's going on, it's circumscribed, there's a routine, you have your friends around you, your family. You probably have some kind of work of some kind, but when you migrate, many of those things are up for grabs. It's you're in a state of of uncertainty, really, and so there are ways in which people try to deal with that. So people tend to migrate to places where they already know people, where they have contacts, people from the same community, members of their family, who they can perhaps live with for a while they find somewhere somewhere of their own. There are tensions, and it's a complicated and contradictory kind of process. Some people feel liberated when they leave, small rural communities, and I know many people who would never go back to the places that they came from, even if someone tried to drag them there, or pay them to go. They just wouldn't do it, because they feel that they've gained something that they need to, that they appreciate. On the other hand, I also know people who constantly talk about how things used to be, and kind of have this romantic idea of life as it was. And one of the things that you notice about a lot of people who put their ideas down on paper about these things, it's very difficult to, if you do go back, it's never the same. I mean, the place that you left is not the place you go back to. Once people have moved away from work, they may still feel the very strong attachments back, but will their children feel the same pulls as they did? And will their children feel the same pulls? I mean, if they come back and the children, get reacquainted with, or perhaps they're acquainted for the first time with Newfoundland, then they may feel those attachments. And people do, one of the difficult things is to work out how these pulls work over time. I'm thinking here of my own family. I mean, I know my father's family. My father, wasn't born on a farm. His mother was. And, they left their farm sometime in the late 1900s. He grew up hearing all these stories. And at the age of 14, he was indentured to a farmer to learn the trade, and that's what so that's how he went into farming. But there was some kind of pull there to something which had been lost sometime back in time, from his family. His mother, had grown up in those circumstances. So I mean, the generational thing is quite interesting. I mean, it doesn't necessarily follow that people. I mean, I see a lot of people coming back here who didn't grow up here, who weren't born here, but who have some connection somewhere along the line. Their grandparents came from Flowers Cove or something, or from somewhere else, and they come back here because it's been talked about in the family, and so there are pulls. So that, I mean, I think it is interesting to think about the generational aspect of nostalgia, of migration, return migration, and the kinds of things that motivate people to move, or drive them to move.
So Jim, is the idea of home still very strong for Newfoundlanders?
It is, yeah. I think so, yeah. Even
Could I get you to say the idea of home?
The idea of home is still, very, very strong. Even when people don't necessarily come back here, it's a reference point. And I think it's also always going to be a reference point for people who grew up here, whose formative experiences in some ways were here. They grew up, they did certain kinds of things, they established themselves as people in that, and so that's, and this place is part of that, of course. So that's why it's always one of the key references that they have, the idea of Newfoundland and its home. Now that idea may not necessarily fit, with, I mean, I've been interested in reading remarks made by people like David Blackwood or some of the other Newfoundland authors who live away, basically, and have been gone for most of their adult lives, that they would always talk about being inspired by an idea of Newfoundland. And I've even read them say, well, but I can't go back there because it's not like that anymore. Right? So it was once like that. Well, perhaps, that's debatable. But they're inspired by an idea, but it's an idea of a place that doesn't really exist. If they come back here, their illusions would be shattered in a moment, I suppose, and they would have to deal with the wreckage. I don't know.